Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining us for the launch of the Housing First Development Collection. I'm John Berger, and I'm the Acting Executive Officer for the West Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. And I'm joined today by Dr. Sam Semberis, Michelle McKenzie, and Leah Watkins. And thank you for joining us this morning. I would like to begin this morning with an acknowledgement of the First Nations people on whose land we meet today. Nala, Kadich, Wajak, Nungamor, Kain Kadik, Nijabuja. And I acknowledge the Wajak Noongar people as the original custodians and continuing owners of the land on which we meet. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, so today's a very special occasion, and the Housing First Development Collection is a partnership between the West Australian Alliance and Shelter WA, and was supported by Lottery West and the work of Curtin University, who undertook the preliminary research on our behalf. I would like to thank each of our partners and contributors to this project. So let me give you some background. When the WA Alliance came together to end homelessness, we acknowledged that a number of key elements would inform and drive our efforts. We always understood that ending homelessness is a whole of community responsibility that requires collaboration of all our efforts being aligned and working towards a common goal. We also agreed that we need to be evidence-driven and that we have a responsibility to inform and educate the community on those methods that are demonstrating what is successful in ending homelessness. So this project was driven by the many questions and inquiries we received from across the community on what can we do to help. One of the key points of evidence towards ending homelessness has been the adoption of Housing First across the globe, both in terms of its effectiveness and rate of success in ending homelessness for individuals. And obviously we are very excited that we have Dr. Sam Semberis with us today, who was key to the development of the Housing First approach. We also acknowledge that affordable, safe and appropriate housing is in short supply in Western Australia. This led us to a point of realising that ending homelessness would need the development of appropriate housing and supports towards our Housing First approach. So with the financial support of Lottery West, the WA Alliance and Shelter WA set about developing this project to address these two key issues. How can we both encourage and educate the community to work towards developing housing solutions that align to Housing First, and how do we make this information available? As mentioned, we drew up the project and brought on Curtin University, who assisted us in conducting the preliminary research to those housing development projects that align with Housing First. They developed a survey based on the Housing First principles and then sent this out globally to any projects we could identify that would match this criteria. We then distilled only those projects and developments that met all the Housing First principles. A number of respondents were then contacted to gain further information and insights. At the same time, Curtin helped us shape the information to be formed into a website, which we will see today. While we've made a start and have both national and global examples, our hope is to keep adding to this resource as we learn of existing or new and emerging projects, and we certainly welcome any suggestions you may have for us. So in summary, going back to our original aim, when we are being asked about what we can do to help, our response is we need more housing that supports Housing First. So this development collection is a resource bank aimed at housing developers, including community housing organisations and private home builders. Our hope is to inspire future housing developments that align with Housing First as we work towards ending homelessness. Okay, so I'm going to now ask Michelle to speak to us, and I hand over to her and tell us more about the critical work that Shelter WA is doing. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone. And I too would like to acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Wajak Noongar Buja here in Walliella, Fremantle. So I'm Michelle McKenzie, CEO of Shelter WA, and I'm a bit of a fangirl. So I'm looking at Dr. Sam Semberis going, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm in the same virtual space as him. It's just amazing. I know for many of our members in the sector, it's been a really tough couple of years. The impact of COVID on people, communities and services. And the rough sleeper response here has been pretty suboptimal. We've kept people on the streets. People have not been safe and they've not been well who have been rough sleeping. And as John said, there's an absolute lack of social and affordable housing here in Perth and across the state at the moment. So our role at Shelter WA is to continue our strong advocacy so that the sector and communities and people in need have the housing and support services that they need to have a great life. And so Housing First, it's evidence-based. We've got the man here in the room, and we need to really, really think about as a state how we're implementing Housing First and our fidelity to the model. So we've got some great examples. There's been some really strong sector leadership in implementation of Housing First in WA. We've got Bob Jordan joining us video later, and it was great a couple of years ago where Bob came over and helped influence and shape our thinking around Housing First. And we've got Leah Watkins here, who did the most amazing study tour of how Housing First principles can be adopted here in our state. So we know it's really tough when there's no housing to not stay the course, to think about alternate models, short-term interim models in response to market failure. But I think it is absolutely critical that we're unwavering and we're vigilant in making sure that Housing First underforms all of our work. And so we really hope and trust that this resource is of value to the sector and our sector partners in keeping the fidelity to the model, staying the course, continuing the strong advocacy and partnerships with government so we do implement Housing First and make sure that everybody in WA has housing that enables them to thrive. So thank you, John, for the opportunity to speak. Little disclaimer for those, many people know I've broken my arm. I have to leave and go and get an x-ray. So I'm really disappointed I can't stay for the rest of today, but I wish everyone well. And I'm going to look at the video recording because I can't wait to hear what Dr. Sambera says and to see Bob. So good luck today, and back to you, John. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for those kind words. Okay, so let me introduce Dr. Sam Semperis. He's a clinical psychologist who was instrumental in developing the Housing First program. He's the founder and CEO of the Pathways Housing First Institute, which provides consultation, technical assistance, presentations and workshops, both in person and online across the globe. And I must admit, it was hard to keep up with you, Sam. 1 minute you're in Ireland, the next minute you're in Greece, and then the next minute you're back in America. So you certainly get out there, which is great to know. Anyway, we're going to do a little bit of a question and answer now. And then at the end of this, I'm also going to invite the audience to ask a couple of questions if you like. And the way to do that essentially would be is to go down and put your hand up, and then we'll invite you to ask any questions. But welcome, Sam, and great that you could join us. So tell us a little bit about how you developed Housing First. What is this Housing First approach, particularly in respect to supporting people to recover and reintegrate into the community?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, John, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, especially hearing your introduction and all of the thoughtfulness that you have put into the idea of implementing Housing First in Western Australia in a way that is true to the fidelity of the model. And I say that not out of any sense of ownership to the model, but having traveled around different communities in different countries, I think that your appreciation that Housing First is both housing and services and has a recovery-oriented philosophy to those services will ensure the success, meaning successful engagement, successful housing, and successful housing retention of those that are served by the program. I don't want to just jump over that because it's nothing to be taken for granted. People often confuse Housing First as housing only, and it's actually much more complicated in a way than that. And you have been very mindful in your survey approach and looking at the data You know, I just want to commend you for that, and I think it's really nice work. So I don't know that there's much more for me to add in the definition of the program itself, other than to say that it's a real pain to run it. You know, it's much easier to just have a building and have 20 apartments and insist that everybody is clean and sober, follows all the damn rules, and just like, you know, just gets on with it. Because then we can go home at 5 and we don't have emergencies and chaos and people, you know, going through all of these harm reduction things. But you know, and maybe this is a warning for people that you want to employ, you know, that you gotta love the messiness of people. You know, you gotta love their humanity. You gotta love the humanity that often is not actually evident when you first meet them. People just look angry, or they look upset or frustrated. But you've got to be able to see in that person their fundamental goodness and humanity, and know that it's there, and know that your job is to help provide the kind of support and the kind of housing and the kind of conditions that it takes to have that person blossom. That's really what it's about. And so it's not a job, you know, it's not because it's not a job you can do 9 to 5, certainly, and it's not a job that will not personally engage you. You can't actually do this work unless you're willing to be changed yourself. You know, I don't remember, you know, people credit Alan Alda with this, but just to be a good listener, you have to be willing to allow yourself to change, which means that if you're going to put yourself aside and listen to what that person's story is, another person's story, and often these stories we hear are painful and difficult, you're going to be affected by it. You're going to be changed by it. You're going to be changed because many of your prejudices or preconceptions or fears or sense of what was possible for a person to endure is going to be stretched beyond what you thought. People have been through very difficult things, but it's a transformative process, not just for the clients we're working with, but also for ourselves.
Yes.
So if you like that kind of thing, then this is a job for you. You know, if you like going home at 5 and not worrying, don't apply.
Yeah, well point. Good point. And I guess it is that humanity that we always got to remember. But I want to draw your attention a little bit to the housing bit of Housing First. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of creating suitable housing options that align with Housing First?
Well, probably this topic has never been more at the forefront of the conversation, as some countries are getting more and more desperate to hide their homeless.
Yes.
And so we have all of these like options that are being presented as creative, like tiny homes or tiny shelters, or like basically these temporary boxes, no bigger than a jail cell, really, you know, and all of them all in one lot, you know, and like somehow being packaged as if this is a nice idea. You know, it's like, it's a nice idea. Would you live there? You know, would you have your family live there? You know, that should be the criteria. You know, it's a nice idea for who exactly? I think, you know, the thing that Housing First has always been is a decent, affordable place to live, like you and I live, you know, like that it's a self-contained apartment, you know, with a lease, and you have tenants' rights. We're talking about, you know, normalizing people's housing so that we're all, you know, living in the same type of housing. So permanence, you know, lease rights, affordability. So the rent subsidy. You know, there's definitely different kinds of models. You know, scattered site in the community, rented from community landlords. Sometimes a single site building with a harm reduction approach. But the tenancy rights is a huge part of it.
Yes.
I guess the only other part I would say about housing, just to bear in mind, that not everybody succeeds in the first house they go into. So, people need a couple of tries. Some people will need more than a couple of tries.
Yes.
And so the program, the Housing First program, is not about admission to this apartment. The Housing First program is you're admitted to the support services that will get you the apartment. So that if you lose the apartment, well, you've lost the apartment. It is a terrible thing. And, we're going to figure out what happened, and hopefully it won't happen the second time, but you don't lose the support. So the housing has to have these characteristics of permanency. Hopefully you can offer people choice, because, the more the person has bought into it, just like with the treatment plan, the more likely they're going to love the place and make it home. This is not about placing people into housing. This is about helping people build a home of their own.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Given your extensive travels and the work that you do, can you cite any examples, good examples of programs, housing developments that you're aware of that have been successful in implementing Housing First?
Well, there's a couple of examples that quickly come to mind. One of them is in Ireland, which just started recently, with the collaboration of the housing and health ministries.
Right.
But I'm going to leave that to Bob to explain.
Yeah, of course.
So I want to talk about Finland because it's sort of an interesting place. And similarly, Norway. I mean, the Scandinavian countries. When you ask them, tell us about homelessness, they say, well, before I tell you about homelessness, this is like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, right? They say, before I tell you about homelessness, I want to tell you about the Nordic social contract.
Yes.
They have time up there, like this, we're gonna talk. So what is the Nordic social contract? It says, well, the Nordic social contract says that we believe that everyone in this country, has a right to housing, has a right to education, has a right to healthcare. We believe that people who make a lot of money should pay a lot of taxes, and people who don't make so much money shouldn't pay as much, percentage-wise. It should be a fair system. And we believe that everybody should be included, like we should take care of each other. So already they're way ahead of the game. I mean, in terms of that kind of shared mission, vision, and values, I think, we could talk about how do you fix a problem, but fixing the problem sits on a shared social contract that's profoundly, it's profound and also shared by the community. So if you're in Western Australia and you're all on board that this is what we're going to do, that's step one. That's huge. What they did in Finland, for example, is they had a foundation, the Y Foundation, the letter Y Foundation.
Yep.
And that foundation was endowed with business, faith community funds, government money, of course, and some of the philanthropic foundations as well. They got a lot of money. And what they did was they either built or purchased every available unit. Build apartment buildings or apartments or condos or houses, like just 15,000 units in about a 10-year period, 15-year period. This is not going to be a quick fix, this thing, right?
No.
So they only had about 2,000 people, maybe 3,000 people in the whole country. It's a small country. So what they did was they used this real estate portfolio because it was run by a nonprofit, and they rented out the units depending on how much money you had. It was like a sliding scale.
Yes.
So many people were paying full price, but the people who were homeless or were on government benefits or were widowed or were single family parents paying 70%, all of these folks would get a subsidy to the rent so that it could be, not bankrupting them to pay rent.
Yes.
So they were able to house all of the people who were homeless And still that portfolio of 15,000 units was profitable because the money was not being taken out and given to shareholders. It was a nonprofit, so it was being reinvested.
Yes.
That's a kind of a spectacular example, and there are many smaller examples of cities and counties that have worked very closely together, but they do have some elements in common: shared vision, shared leadership, enough resources to address the problem, I think, are essential features of really doing it well.
Yes. No, thank you. No, I think what you've touched on it's just a timely reminder for us all around that shared vision, the shared leadership, and I guess the commitment, and like you said, the fundamental belief that yes, this is the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah. And the commitment, it's not like a political commitment, like vote for me and I'll give you this, because it's a long-term project. You have to be really committed to seeing it through, through administrative or political changes.
Yes. Yes. All right. I'm now going to throw it open to the audience to give them the opportunity to ask.
People could also type questions in the chat if they wanted to, I suppose.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Either raise your hand or put a comment or a question in the chat. So let's have just a couple of questions and then we'll keep moving. Okay, so over to you, audience. Would anyone like to ask a question? Does anyone raise their hands? Hang on, one attendee. Who's that? Sorry, is that Deb Zanella? Deb Zanella.
Yes, it is. Morning, John. Morning, Sam.
Hi, good morning.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
my question is probably a little bit more existential. Given you've been in this space for some years now and, and pioneered.
Thank you for putting it so delicately.
It was nothing to do with the colour of your hair, Sam. Do you still have hope around our ability to achieve a state where we do end homelessness, where rough sleeping, where people exiting into homelessness is rare, it's episodic, and we respond to it in a way that is quick, keeps their humanity, provides them shelter, amidst all that is occurring across the world, and the move to more right-wing ideologies and the deserving poor and the under, et cetera, et cetera. Do you still have hope?
I'll tell you two stories in answer to that question, because I recently had a conversation with this friend of mine, Hani, who works for the United Nations. And I mean, I just met them, and so I said, Hani, you work for the United Nations. What part of the United Nations do you work for? He says, well, I work on peace in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine. And I'm like, holy shit, you work on Middle Eastern peace? It's like, how do you keep hope alive, Hani? How do you, these people have been killing themselves for 40 years. How do you keep hope alive? And he says to me, Sam, you work in homelessness. So, it's like, oh yeah. Oh, how do I keep, I feel, I would have hung it up. I would have stopped working on this if I didn't have hope, okay? Now, because you can't actually do this work if you don't have hope. You can't, because you have to transmit hope to communities. You have to transmit hope person by person. Your life can be better than this. I want to help you. So hope is a huge ingredient in this, and faith, in that sense of believing it can be better. What gives me hope is that there are so many examples of success that have already happened. They've not been global, I grant you that, but like the thing in Finland that I just described. Recently, we had a conference and people from Milwaukee, Wisconsin were presenting. It's a city of 700,000 people, and they've been doing Housing First for 5 years, okay? They had 400 and something chronic sleepers when they started. The city and the county, the housing authority, they all got on board. They committed to the model. The housing authority had enough vouchers. On the last count, when they do the one night count here in the States, Milwaukee, and you could look at this up on the HUD website, had 17 people on the street after 4 years, 17 from hundreds to 17. That gives me hope.
Yeah.
The veterans in this country, because of the resources that Congress committed to them, there are 83 cities in the States, 83 cities in the States that have ended veterans' homelessness. So what gives me hope is the fact that if we do this right, and if we put the resources in place, we can solve this problem. So it's not going to be like all at once. It looks like we're going to have to do it from the ground up, one community at a time, the way it's occurring. But if it wasn't for those communities, Deborah, I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. It's a really timely reminder when, the sort of the politics of the day and all of those other interconnected issues but it's an important reminder to keep the broader vision and hope, and that the possibility is real.
It's a long-term battle, and I'm amazed at how much pushback there is now on housing first. It's like I thought it was an evidence-based model, and like we're just like a question of getting people are pushing back, because I think the more success you demonstrate, ultimately we're going to have to talk about capitalism, and we're talking about income disparity and racial disparity, and now we're pushing up against the powers that be. That's why we're getting pushback. This is not going to be a slow battle. This is not about solving homelessness today, because even if we solved homelessness today, we'd have homeless people tomorrow, because we still have income disparity, racism, and everything else that's creating it faster than but we're beginning to point to those larger forces. I think that's why we're getting pushback. But for me right now, that just makes me want to fight harder.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Deborah. We have a bit of a question from Alice Brown. She was in Finland in 2016, Sam, and she said that I've been to Finland and seen many people experiencing homelessness there. This makes me wonder, is there a difference between the political narrative and the reality, and why are these people falling through the gaps? So obviously that's about 5 years ago. Yeah. So what's your observations? What have you seen?
Well, I think there's always a difference between the political reality and the actual reality on the ground. I can't comment on that. I don't know really, I understand Alison's experience with that. And when was that?
Well, she went in 2016, she said.
Oh, 2016 is not when they ended it. They ended homelessness like 2021 or 2020. It was only recent they went down to, they have a graph on the Y Foundation website. So yes, when you were there, they were not telling the story that, they went down to 52 shelter beds in Helsinki, which is what they are at now. But so I think it was earlier. That's my guess, Alison.
Yeah, okay. All right. We'll have time for one more question. I've got a question from Ursula Dixon. You mentioned that sometimes not everyone is successful on their first or even subsequent opportunities. What would see a client lose their accommodation, or do they leave and at a point the home is considered vacant, or sadly has it had to be more forceful action? I guess talks about when people's tenancy breaks down.
Yeah, I mean, even in the best of programs, the success rate for housing stability is 80 or 90%, which is like, really, really good compared to like other, like rapid rehousing or shelter or any of that. But we're still talking about 10 or 20% of the people that, we can't help them at this point in time with this, independent apartment. And I think for some people, they're going to need a different approach, and whether that becomes, something like, because you've had now 2 years or so of history and it's not working. You get, I would say that I wouldn't then try another apartment. but I wouldn't sever the relationship. Remember, the program is about the relationship. Say, you know, this housing type that you want and we wanted to give you isn't working.
Yes.
We got to try something else. I want to work with you to find something else. Let's try, why don't you go to a recovery house, or why don't you try treatment? Because we can't afford another apartment, more furniture, and, you know, another go at it. It's too much. You know, we still care about you. We still want to help you, but we got to find another way.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess that's the key to it, isn't it? It's that individual response.
Yes.
And what works for one individual may not necessarily work for another. So
right. I mean, you know, the thing, like, lots of people lose the first one, you know, actually do better in the second one, you know, like because they learn a very valuable lesson. Yeah. But then there's like people that, you know, just you need a different, it's a very, very individualized approach. I mean, the program is clear enough in terms of the basic principles, but then when you actually start to run it, it's person by person. Another reason that it's not for everybody. No. You know, you got to be like willing to have that flexibility and treat every person, you know, on their own terms.
All right, Sam, I think we're going to move on.
Okay.
We really
thanks
appreciate
very much.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. And we're obviously extremely thankful that you could join us. And I understand that you might be going. So we appreciate that you're able to spend time with us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks, everyone.
No worries.
Bye.
Okay, well, we're going to move on to Bob Jordan, as Sam had mentioned. Bob Jordan is the CEO of the Housing Agency. Since 2018, he has been the National Director of the Irish Government Housing First program, who has seen it go from a pilot phase to full implementation across Ireland. Bob came to Western Australia in 2019 and was instrumental in helping shape the department's 10-year strategy by adopting the Housing First approach. We feel very privileged to hear from someone who has overseen the rollout of Housing First on a national level across Ireland. Now, I must say that due to time zones, we didn't ask Bob to get up at 2:30 a.m. And so I recorded an interview with him last Friday, and Royston is now going to play that video for you. Go, Royston. Thank you for joining us today, Bob Jordan. Bob, tell me a little bit about your background and the role that you've played in implementing Housing First in Ireland.
Well, John, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Housing First has really been a program in Ireland since 2011. There was a pilot program in Dublin, and it's become mainstream since 2014. I suppose one of the things that's significant in Ireland is that Housing First is now a government program, and I suppose my role from 2018 onwards was as National Director of Housing First, really ensuring that Housing First was available to everybody who needed it in Ireland across all 31 local authority areas that we have. Since then, I've taken up a role as Chief Executive of the Housing Agency, which really supports the government in delivering housing solutions across the country. And just recently, we've established a National Housing First office, a government office for Housing First. So I suppose maybe the main lesson from Ireland, John, would be that having Housing First as a government-sponsored program is really important to get it to scale, given the level of resources required in terms of permanent housing, the wraparound health services, and the funding that's needed really for the voluntary bodies, the NGOs that are supporting Housing First tenants in their homes.
Thank you. I want to maybe focus in on the housing aspect. So in your experience, tell me about how housing options can play a significant role in people's recovery and reintegration into the community.
So I think the first thing to say about the housing is that we follow the Pathways Housing First model, the original model developed by Dr. Samson Barrett, which talks about scattered site housing. So housing scattered in the community rather than in congregate settings, because that gives people the best opportunity to be supported, but also to integrate into the community. I think Housing First is a mainstream intervention, so people should be able to get social housing, private rented housing, and so on. Now, the reality is in Ireland, I think most people will get social housing either provided by local authorities or, you know, our equivalent of community housing associations. But there are people living in the private rented sector. But obviously the issue with private rented very often is about the security of tenure and so on. So I would say the main thing is that it's a mainstream housing intervention, giving people the opportunity to, you know, choose where they want to live within a community is really important. So the element of consumer choice is very important in terms of housing options. I know in most countries, you know, you don't have an endless choice because there's, you know, there's a constriction in terms, but I think there has to be some real choices within the housing that's available.
Talking about those choices, what are some of the best examples that you've seen and why does that work?
Well, I think that, you know, listen, sometimes there's standalone housing in the community and that's fine. I think the issue with apartment blocks is that you don't want an over concentration of housing first tenants there. So let's say it's a scheme of 11 terraced houses. You wouldn't put more than maybe 2 housing first tenants in there. I think when we're looking at apartments, we're also looking at own door access, because very often, I suppose, you know, people moving around within corridors and so on can draw a little bit of attention to them, especially if they're still active in their addiction or they have mental health issues and so on. So I suppose in terms of choosing housing, we're trying to choose it in a way that allows that person to settle in the community. It does happen, and the primary reason that people lose their housing first tenancies is because they lose control of their front door. Maybe people they've associated with in the street, you know, come to their home and they sort of lose control of their home. This happens quite a bit. So very often, you know, you need to maybe relocate that person to a different housing first tenancy. That's one of the commitments of Housing First. And you might even, you know, if there's been a lot of issues going on in a property, in a community, you might decide to rest that house from Housing First, not use it for Housing First, use it for general needs social housing or something like that.
Okay. So talking about this in terms of, can you share any experiences where you've seen poor housing options impacting on people's capacity to recover?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if people are given insecure housing, or, you know, maybe the housing doesn't really fit their needs, or, you know, if they can't have their pets there, or, you know, if they have a partner or so on, like, I think the most important, the reason it doesn't fit usually is because the person really hasn't had a choice in it, or else the choice that they've made, they realize, like, we do have people who've chosen to live in a particular area, and then they sort of say, listen, you know, actually, I'm well known in this area, so people are kind of targeting the house, or, you know, my mates know where to find me. Perhaps it might be better if you move me somewhere else. And sort of people kind of learn as they go about that. Sometimes if we put people into an apartment development and there's big wide corridors and so on, and, you know, they might draw maybe a little bit too much attention to themselves, and that could be an issue as well. So like the person's involvement in the selection of housing is really important. And sometimes people learn as they go. So what we find in the Housing First program, most people do stick in their first tenancy. But sometimes people need to learn a little bit more about themselves and the housing that fits them as part of the program.
Okay, thank you. I guess if I was to put a sort of a person, a hat on, let's say I'm interested in being part of a solution and developing housing options, what would be your message to anyone considering developing housing options that would lead towards ending homelessness?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is to give people, like, the most important thing in Housing First is the promise of permanent housing and the promise of time unlimited supports. So that promise needs to be real. Also, you know, rapid rehousing people is part of the Housing First program. So we do have people in Ireland who've received maybe 4 or 5 Housing First tenancies. And, you know, maybe if you come back to me and talk to me in a couple of years' time, John, they might have had 7 or 8 tenancies, but that's the promise. Now, there is a small number of people for which Housing First doesn't work, and they may need long-term supported accommodation. In other words, a tenancy, but with 24-hour staff on-site support. But that's a smaller number of people. And I suppose like my message would be, if you follow the Pathways Housing First model, maintain fidelity to that, you will get, you know, 75 to 85% success rate. In fact, we're so confident about that in Ireland that we've built it into the contract. So here in Dublin, the Housing First provider is contractually obliged to deliver an 85% success rate. And if it goes below 80%, which it's never done, some corrective action has to be taken. So at the moment, I think the success rate is around 87%. So, follow the model, get the results. And that's because there's been so many, randomized controlled trials, evaluations of Housing First that say, if you put all the ingredients together, you get the results. And I suppose the most important thing is just that we've had people who've been on the streets, John, in some cases for decades. And those people have moved permanently out of homelessness. Sometimes, even for all of us who've been working on it for a long time, Housing First is still a miracle in terms of what it can achieve.
Yeah. No, great advice, and thank you for taking the time to be part of our launch today. And we appreciate your sharing your experiences and wisdom with us today. Thank you.
You're more than welcome, John. Hello to everybody in Western Australia.
On mute. Goodness me. Some really insightful comments from Bob. I thought he really threw the challenge out there where he said they actually contracted the Housing First providers with a minimum success rate of 80%. So that's how confident they are. Anyway, we're going to move to a local flavour now, and we've invited Leah to join us this morning in terms of what we're doing. And Leah has worked in the homelessness sector for quite a long time. She currently works as the manager, tenant engagement and capacity building for Housing Choices. Prior to this, she was the manager of the Zero Project, or formerly the 50 Lives, 50 Homes at Rua. It was during this time that she completed the Housing First European Hub Train the Trainer program and co-authored the Australian Housing First Principles, which has guided this project. Leah will tell us about your work and what you've learned about housing design for Housing First. And I think you've got some slides for us, so bring up your slides.
Thanks, John. Before I show some slides, like John, I wanted to acknowledge that we live and work on Whadjuk Noongar land. And as part of that, a commitment that a lot of our work should be really focused on reducing and ending the homelessness for that community who have a completely disproportionate amount of both homelessness and intergenerational homelessness. As John mentioned a little while ago, I moved over to go work for my favourite community housing provider. Having worked in homelessness space for years and having worked in Housing First and ending homelessness campaigns, I wanted to go learn about, so what does it actually take to house people and keep them housed from that perspective? So this morning, I don't want to talk about Housing First per se, particularly following the steps of Sam Samberis, for God's sake, he's already told us all about that stuff. But to look at what the housing we need is to go with that Housing First. So, where did that share slide button go? Share slide, that one. Voila. John, shout loudly if I've managed to do it wrong, because it kept failing in the practices. So before we get into it, we need to talk
we haven't got your slides up yet, Leah. You might try that again. Sorry.
I knew that would happen. Right. Share screen. That screen. Share slide. Did it happen?
No.
Damn. Oh well. Carry on regardless. You'll have to just look at my face rather than a pretty picture of an elephant in a room. So the first thing...
You might want to stop sharing though, because I think that's all that people are seeing. That's it. Okay, you're right to go.
Just good to go. Okay, so before we want to talk about housing design, it's worth having a little nod to the elephant in the room. That actually we can't sort of do, like the people at Y Foundation who Sam mentioned, you can't do Housing First unless you do the Housing First. And we've got a real struggle in WA because we're trying to do Housing First in the middle of a crisis. So the moment you start talking about Housing First, someone will always say, but where's the housing? Anglicare brought out their rental affordability study recently. And, there's a 12% increase in rents in Perth, 13.5% down south, half as many properties available as there had been previously, and not a single one of them is affordable for someone on the single JobKeeper allowance. And to be frank, most of the people we're trying to house are on single JobKeeper allowances. And this has put the Housing First services and the Housing First that that we're working with at a bit of a risk, because back in the day, pre-COVID, when life was shiny and sunny, the commitment had been to deliver housing first support services and alongside it a private rental subsidy so we could get the housing in quickly. But in the light of the market, that's not been delivered. So we've got people out there trying to work and deliver housing first, but they don't have that resourcing to access housing. And if they turn to social housing, you know, there's 13,000 people on the statewide joint wait list, 9,000 in Perth alone. So it's really hard to do those housing first approach of trying to get someone housed as soon as possible if you're in that sort of wait list. So I do want to acknowledge that the government's trying to invest in social housing. They're trying to do some stuff about this, some nice stuff coming up, but building those houses is going to take time, you know, particularly when you can't get a tradie for love or money at the moment. So the resource that you're launching today to try and draw in other people into this space to help deliver housing, to get other resources and other people on board to create more options is what we need to be able to deliver housing first. So if we do get extra housing, what are some of the nice design principles that we can put into that? So my first slide's a lovely little picture, and it talks about one size does not fit all. So there's some housing first principles about people having a right to home and choice and self-determination that are really critical when you're thinking about this. And there's some great work done around the Noongar housing first principles that take that a little bit further around people have a right to home with cultural connections to Budja, Morton, Karajan, and choice and self-determination without cultural compromise. So to be able to actually deliver that, we don't need suburbs full of 4x1s and 3x1s and 4x2s. What we need is a whole mix of different things. People sleeping rough are primarily single, so we need smaller houses for them. Aboriginal people, who make up an embarrassingly large proportion of our homeless population, have lots of family obligations and visitors coming and going, so we need some larger houses. Some people like gardening, some people have pets, some people don't want to be responsible for too much space because, you know, they're embarrassed about how little they have. Some people want lots of space so they don't feel like they're hemmed in. A little while ago, a couple of years back, I got contacted by an architecture department who wanted to run a competition for their students to design housing for homeless people. And they really struggled to get their head around the fact that something magical happens when you put a homeless person in a house. They become a person and they have the same sort of mix of things and mix of needs that everybody else has. So yeah, someone will want their nice little funky modular design tiny house and someone else will want a brick and tile place in the suburb. The second design thing I want to talk about, and it might not seem like a big deal, but if I was God, this is the one thing I would do, is soundproofing. Housing First talks about people having a tenancy the same as everyone else. And to do that, you have the same principles as everyone else. Pay your rent, don't trash the place too much, and don't annoy your neighbours too much. Many years ago, when I was a student, I had a lecturer who did this amazing talk, which concluded that the reason most young people were in jail was the fault of town planners. And I'd like to argue that the reason most people are evicted is the fault of architects. Because actually, as a housing provider, particularly as a benevolent housing provider, you can work with some of that stuff. If people don't pay their rent, you can do rent, payment plans. There's even a mob over east that have this nice community service to down pay rent. If people have poor property standards, you can adjust your expectations around that and help them work on bite-sized bits and get back towards it. It's all within your relationship as a housing provider with that person. But if people have conflict with their neighbours, then there's other people involved and you really got to deal with that. And that stuff, if we had good soundproofing, it would reduce neighbour complaints. It would reduce re-triggering, traumas. It would reduce all of that conflict. The thing that you're going to miss on my slide is I had some case studies up there. So I'll just sort of run through those. So Bob makes loud phone calls and scrapes his furniture around when he's been drinking once a fortnight, and his downstairs neighbour complains all the time because she's trying to study and she can't bear the noise, even though he tries to apologise, bless him. Eric hears voices through the thin walls, and they get muddled up in the voices he hears in his head and the voices of the neighbour, that particular person abandoned his home because it drove him sort of, you know, too much just hearing that muddled voices. Jenny shouts as part of her mental health. It's a real release for her, soothing to do that shouting, but her neighbours are terrified because of her shouting and they don't want to have visitors around. And, you know, even though she's not screaming at them, it has that conflict. And then you have another case. We had someone called Margaret. They're not called this. I made up the names, by the way. So experienced violence both as an adult as a child, and everyone's really excited because we've got her into this home. But in the complex, hearing other people shouting in the complex just re-triggers that trauma. So all of those cases where someone's, you know, housing doesn't feel safe, or they lose their tenancy, or they abandon their tenancy, or they're kicked out of their tenancy because they just can't, you know, meet the requirements of the Residential Tenancy Act, and housing providers do have a responsibility in that space, they could all be solved by soundproofing. And the final one I wanted to talk about is actually about environmental stuff and being green. So on the slide that you can't see, I've got a whole list of things that, you know, environmental activists say you should put this in your housing: solar panels, passive cooling, air sealing, LED lighting, insulation, double glazing, rainwater collection, water conservation features, use of natural light, quality build, low cost maintenance. They all have something in common. They all reduce the cost of living for the tenant. And most of our tenants in Housing First are in poverty. So if you're looking at housing design for Housing First, have a look at environmental design. I think there's a bit of a tendency sometimes for social and community housing providers to think about, oh, you know, cheap build, best bang for your buck, we can get the most houses. But I think we should do the best bang for the buck for the tenants, because they've got a lot less bucks than we have. There was a lovely mob we met up in Geraldton a while back who were talking about, actually they really wanted social housing to have solar panels because it will reduce their electricity bills, reduce their you know, hot water bills and things like that. I know at Housing Choices we put solar in for one particular tenant because he was an elder in a large Aboriginal family, so he kept having lots and lots of visitors, and he was really struggling to pay his rent as well as keep up the electricity for that. So they're just a few ideas in terms of, if we're looking at getting people to come in and build housing for us, not just to have, hey, we need more houses to deliver Housing First, but we need particular types of houses. And, you know, we need to think about the design of that, because that will actually help us deliver those services better and help people have the safe homes that they deserve.
Thank you. Look, that's a really timely reminder, I guess, that we do need to have an individual approach, and that you have to work in partnership, and we need to learn from what we've learned. And I think, you know, what you've shared with us is some of the learnings that you've found in the space of providing housing. What are those lessons? What are the things that we can take into account, like you said, in terms of design and features that will make it more successful? So yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm actually going to allow a couple of questions again, if that's okay, Leah. And I'm sure we'll put the slides up on, if you don't mind sharing the slides.
Yeah, no, it's fine. You can have the slides.
But we'll put it up and send it out to everyone so that people can see the slides as well. So yes, I'll invite a couple of questions. So again, either use the raise hand function or the Q&A. So does anyone have any questions for Leah? Niall's giving you a clap hands.
I saw
Leah.
that, it made me smile. Thanks, Niall.
No burning questions from anyone?
They're all just completely convinced. That's done.
All right, well, what we'll do is, are you still able to stay with us, Leah, for the moment? Because I'll go through the website now, and Leah, I loved you talking about the issue with architects and soundproofing. There you go.
Cool.
Thumbs up on that one. So yeah, so what we'll do is I will now walk you through the website that we've developed, and then at the end of that we'll have time for more questions. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask of myself or of Leah, then please put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll respond to them. Okay, so let's let me get myself in order here with the website. And bear with me, and hopefully if I go to share screen, this will work. Okay, can everyone see that? Yep, I'm assuming. Can you see that, Leah? The website? It's not working?
Yes.
Royston, you can see it, can you?
Yep, I certainly can.
All right, okay. All right, let's go through the website. So this is the Housing First Development Collection website, which is now live, and we'll put a link in the chat for people if they want to go directly to it themselves. And yeah, so I'm just going to spend a short couple of minutes just taking you through some of the features of the website. From the front screen, you'll see there are a number of tabs here, and we're going to begin with the Housing First tab. So in this section, we really want to cover off much of the elements and understanding about what Housing First is. And if we go to what is Housing First, you'll see there is a description, and you'll also see our guest today, Sam, give a YouTube clip. So yeah, so what you'll do is you'll find a little bit of a history of Housing First and how it has shifted the way that we respond to homelessness from a more traditional staircase model through to immediate housing with supports. What else? And then about what is Housing First, you'll see some further information. So what you can do is you can go through you know, different elements. There's talk about congregate versus scatter site type developments, and we know that there is a place for each. And you'll see, you'll have heard from Sam, who talked at Finland, who basically tried to acquire as many properties as they could, including building it. And so it's not restricted to new builds. You can use existing stock to support the Housing First approach. Okay, so then we go into the actual Housing First models, and you'll see here that we have a list of the models that had responded to our survey and had met the criteria for Housing First. And so you'll see that these are the more sort of scatter site approaches, and then these are the congregate models. And I guess the one that we know the most about is the common ground approach. And if you then go into one of the options, what you'll get is a description of the project. This is a Victorian one. The lead organisation is Launch Housing. It is modular housing. They've delivered 47 and assisted 48 people. There's a description, what was the built form, some of the financial details, and then obviously any related information. So there's obviously a YouTube clip, and then there's a couple of stories shared by individuals who were assisted by that particular program. So we've tried to give people a sense and a flavour of a particular model or intervention or program that has been developed. And you'll also see the 50 Lives, 50 Homes, which has been operating for a number of years here in Western Australia. It uses the sort of scatter approach of housing across the community. And we've also decided to include the My Home project, even though it actually hasn't provided or is in construction at this point in time, but we felt it was worthy of a mention in terms of and providing modular housing as a West Australian example. And then if we go to Common Ground, You'll see the Brisbane Common Ground. Again, the same description, the built form, some of the financial modelling. I mean, what we're encouraging you is, as you look at it and read it, if you are more interested, then obviously contact the organisation. There's often web links. There is information about the particular projects, and we would encourage you to make contact with those organisations. So that's some of the Australian examples. Like I said, this is only a start. What our hope is to continue to add to this collection and continue to profile those projects that reflect the intent of this website. So if we then go to the international models, we have a number of examples that have been that have responded to the survey, including Finland. So as you heard Sam speak. And then we've also included a couple of social impact investment models, and I'll come back to those. So if we just quickly go to, say, the Y Foundation, I mean, in some ways, what Finland has done, you'll see they've delivered over 17,000 dwellings. So it's obviously not something that's been achieved overnight, but over a number of decades, and a commitment to providing housing. They provide scatter site and congregate housing in terms of their housing response, and have been operating since 1985. And again, you'll see information and links to different reports and different information on the Y Foundation. I'll also hit this one, which is in New Zealand, which is a bit closer to home for us. So this is a program, a Housing First program in Auckland in New Zealand. It uses scatter site housing. It is government funded. They have delivered 920 dwellings and assisted over 1,500 people. And so, again, there is some key information that you'll be able to find on that particular model. So the other thing that we did include is the social investment models that have been included as potential examples of how you can scale up housing developments and how they've used the sort of impact modelling to create that. So the two that are provided is one based in Canada, where money or finances and encouragement was made for looking at housing first programs across regional areas across Canada. And then the social impact investment model from the US. So if I go into this, you'll see that the lead organisation is BC Housing. It's a partnership. They look at high density and scatter site housing, so they're not necessarily locked into any one particular model. They've delivered over 1,000. And you'll see that essentially they have provided finance to help lead housing development projects, which have then yielded the properties. And so again, there's information there. And we know obviously in each country, the situations are different in terms of tax rulings and in particular leveraging opportunities, but we thought it was worth including here as a way of maybe stimulating some thinking and debate at a local level in terms of how can we do this and scale this up. But we also are aware, as Leah had mentioned, that at the moment we have a skill shortage, and so scaling up any projects at the moment would obviously present some particular challenges. Then we have a resources page. So in the resources page, what we've provided are links to websites, and those websites, all the ones that you see, are essentially here in a quick way to hit those. So if you were particularly interested in something or a particular model, you could go to this page and bring up their information We also have included a media page, which are mainly YouTube clips. So any of the projects that have been profiled or that's connected to or relevant to what we're trying to do, essentially you can see some of the YouTube clip reports there. So that's all compiled in there. And then obviously we have a reports page where we've put links to a range of different reports that have been published that are publicly available. So there's a quick link to both national and Australian reports through to international reports and evaluations. And then finally, any particular toolkits that we know are out there, we've put those here in this section. So, and then finally, we do hope to have, we hope to continue to profile any news or any developments. It's our hope that we will keep an eye on the common ground developments, and any media announcements or any news announcements would go into this page, and anything that we think's worthy of attention in terms of the notion of developing housing under the Housing First approach. So there, and then obviously we've got an events page with our launch here today, and any other events that we're likely to have, we'll put in here. So then finally, we'll just have quick links to Shelter and the West Australian Alliance. So we will circulate the link. We'll send out information about this, and we're going to do a bit of a launch of this website. So hopefully it's something that you can go to very easily and find content and essentially learn more about those developments that have, brought on or committed to housing first and providing housing that essentially leads to homelessness. So there's probably not anything more that I want to cover off on the website, apart from encouraging you to go to it. So we'll now have an opportunity for any more questions, and I'm just trying to pick up and see what's happening in the chat, and invite anyone to ask questions at this point. Anyone want to put their hand up? Leah, do you want to make any responses to what you've seen?
Question earlier from Shauna, who was asking about if there's any developments in the community housing space. One of the things I've learned coming over to community housing is that actually pretty much all of our housing is done through the joint waitlist, which sort of really limits the capacity of community housing providers to step outside that, which was why some of the stuff that was negotiated through the 50 Lives, 50 Homes campaign and things like that to, provide allocations towards that. We are doing a supportive landlord pilot down in Bunbury, which is where we've got the capacity to prioritise people sleeping off the by name list for the properties coming up, so we can actually jump the list and pull out those people that are most vulnerable, do a best fit allocation, so try and get the house that suits them. And we've got a little tiny bit of funding over that so that we can actually absorb some additional commercial risk and provide the capacity for our staff to work alongside. So we're really excited about that as a model that complements Housing First, by saying that Housing First shouldn't just be about support providers working differently, but also about housing providers working differently. So very keen to see how that goes. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. Anyone else got any other questions? I mean, I guess my response to the audience too is, if you know of or hear of anything that fits within this approach, then please let us know, because we would be more than interested to hear about or aware of. Because what we hear what we're trying to do is both educate and encourage more developments. And we know that we need a diversity of response, and it's the richness in that diversity that helps us work towards that goal. So, sorry, there's a question. Is there a question there? I'd love to, if we could do the pilot program in Perth. Seems to be working well in Bunbury. There you go.
Oh, we definitely love to. It's based on something that's been done in the mental health space for a long time with the independent living program, because that realization that, you know, and ILP is now years old, actually support services sometimes disappear. And so the landlord can be that sort of canary in the mine to go, you know, someone's tenancy starting to fall apart. If someone's not paying their rent, or you know, the property standards are dropping and they're arguing with their neighbours more, that can be indicators of support needs. So the capacity for housing providers to reach out and bring support back in, rather than have to go through the sort of more punitive breach and eviction process, would be really cool.
All right, there's a question here from Kit Scott. I'm curious to hear more about Noongar Housing First and where we can find out more about what's happening in that space.
Go to Noongar Myanmar's website. They did a beautiful piece of work where they bounced off the Australian Housing First principles and looked at their, like the Noongar cultural framework, and so how that can be interpreted and adapted into the Noongar stuff. It's a beautiful piece of work where they've looked at, you know, support being based around strengthening Wirran, which is spirit, and, you know, that whole sense of, you know, land and budget being a critical part of housing and the connection to family. And yeah, it's really lovely. But yeah, Noongar Myanmar's website.
Yep.
And I think it's on shelters as well.
Wanting to deliver this training extensively across the sector. So it will be a case of watching this space. Someone's raised a comment about we're delivering housing first without prioritisation or nomination rights. Can we trial something similar in the metro area? And I guess that alludes to that whole notion about wait turn versus best fit, doesn't it?
Yep. Yeah, and I think because of the way the regulation system is in place around community housing providers, we actually need to get permission from the government to go outside the, you know, going in turn, even off the priority list. So yeah, lobby for it hard. We need it. And, you know, once you've got that, just the capacity to be able to, you know, do program swaps and help people, you know, get the right house. It's much more effective. The work that the Zero Project did, and I think it was in their last evaluation, that really showed if you can do a best fit allocation rather than the top of the list allocation, the retention rates, particularly longer term, are really significant. Like it's about, you know, after 3 years, about 60% for system as normal and about 87% for best fit allocations.
All right. Well, it's a final call for any questions. Doesn't look like there's been a lot to take in. There's been a lot talking at you, I realise. But I thought it was really important that we have drawn on the expertise that we are aware of out there in terms of Sam and Bob and Leah to help excite us and help motivate us to really tackle this challenge head on. And our hope is that obviously this resource will be one that people will refer to, that you will let others know about this resource as well, encourage them to look at that. And, you know, any connections that you have, whether it's within our sector or across the building industry or in the private community or Rotary clubs or whatever, we certainly encourage you to share this information and let people know, because what we're hoping is that once people have a look at this really starts to stimulate their thinking and encourage their thoughts and challenges them to come up with some, what we know are best practice responses to providing housing and working towards homelessness. So I would like to thank everyone for your time this morning. I know we've gone well over the hour, and but it's been a great opportunity to reflect and think about what we're doing and how we're going about it, and also getting excited about what those potential answers and models could be in terms of housing first. I would like to take the opportunity to thank, obviously, Curtin, who helped us with the initial research, particularly both Amity and Stephen, Adam, who I think some of them have joined us this morning. So thank you for that.